The Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. A quorum being present, the committee meets today to consider H.R. 511. Given time constraints, I would ask that members insert any written statements into the record. I will hold the record open until the end of the day in order to accommodate those members who may not have prepared written statements. I now recognize myself for an opening statement for today's committee consideration of H.R. 511. And good morning to all of my colleagues and to what appears to be a packed house out here. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 511, the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act of 2015. This important legislation will prevent the National Labor Relations Board from exerting jurisdiction over Native American businesses operating on tribal lands. As we all know, policies governing labor management relations are extremely complex and controversial. More than 80 years after its enactment, the National Labor Relations Act continues to be a source of heated debate in the United States Congress and in workplaces across the country. No doubt that debate will continue in this committee as we work to ensure the law is implemented fairly and objectively. But that's a debate for another time. The bill before us is not about union workers versus non-union workers. It's not about big business versus big labor, and it's not about Republican versus Democrat. The bill we are considering today is about whether Native Americans should be free to govern employee-employee relations in a way that they determine is best for their workplaces. Over the last 10 years, the National Labor Relations Board has taken an approach contrary to the rights of Native Americans and long-standing labor policies. In a 2004 decision, the Board broke from more than 30 years of precedent and decided it has jurisdiction over tribal activities. Since that time, the Board has determined on a case-by-case basis whether a business on tribal land is for commercial purposes, and if it is, the Board will assert its jurisdiction over that business. At a subcommittee hearing held in June, Rodney Butler, chairman of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation of Connecticut, criticized the Board's decision as, quote, an affront to Indian country. He went on to say that the Board's flawed logic suggests that Indian tribes are incapable of developing laws and institutions to protect the rights of employees who work on reservations. Jefferson Keel, Lieutenant Governor of the Chickasaw Nation, described the Board's approach as, quote, incompatible with the very nature of sovereignty and self-government, close quote. Imagine the public outcry we would hear across the country if the Board began imposing its will on enterprises owned and operated by state and local governments, such as schools, parks, and recreation centers. Are we supposed to believe that state leaders in California and Connecticut are more capable of managing their affairs than the leaders of the Shakopee and Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribes? Yet for more than a decade, that's precisely the message the Board has sent to Native Americans. It is time for Congress to right this wrong, and the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act will help us do just that. The bill amends the National Labor Relations Act to reaffirm that the National Labor Relations Board cannot assert its authority over Indian tribes and enterprises or institutions owned and operated by an Indian tribe on tribal land. This is the same standard that was in place before the Board abruptly changed course, and it must be the standard that governs the Board's actions moving forward. I want to thank Mr. Todd Rokita for his leadership on this important issue. Over the years, a number of men and women in Congress have helped lead the fight on behalf of tribal sovereignty. Thanks to their hard work, we are here considering a proposal that will restore Indian tribes the ability to regulate labor relations in their businesses and ensure they are afforded the same rights and protections enjoyed by state and local government leaders. 2 years ago, President Obama signed an executive order establishing a White House Council on Native American Affairs. Now, I'm not usually one to cite favorably an executive order by the President. I know that will be shocking to some of you, but I do believe this one is pertinent to today's meeting. The executive order says, quote, the United States recognizes a government-to-government relationship as well as a unique legal and political relationship with federally recognized tribes. Honoring these relationships and respecting the sovereignty of tribal nations is critical to advancing tribal self-determination and prosperity, close quote. That is the essence of why we are here today, to honor and respect the sovereignty of tribal nations. Native Americans have spoken loud and clear. They do not want an unelected and unaccountable federal labor board dictating policies in their workplaces. I urge my colleagues to stand with the Native American community by supporting the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act. And with that, I will now recognize my distinguished colleague, Mr. Hinojosa, who is the senior Democratic member of the Committee right now for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Klein. Today, we're taking up the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act of 2015, H.R. 511. Legislation that would strip employees of the protections afforded by the National Labor Relations Act at any enterprise owned and operated by Indian tribe and located on Indian lands. At issue in this bill are two solemn and deeply rooted principles. One is the rights that Indian tribes possess as distinct, independent political communities, retaining their original natural rights in matters of local self-government. The second issue is the rights of workers to organize, bargain collectively, and engage in concerted activities for mutual aid and protection. Rather than attempting to reconcile these competing principles, H.R. 511 chooses sovereignty for some over the rights of others. Hundreds of thousands of workers, most of whom are not members of tribes, of their voice in the workplace in one fell swoop. This bill would take away workers' rights even where treaties did not restrict the application of workplace laws such as the National Labor Relations Act. By depriving workers of the right to organize and bargain collectively, this bill establishes a double standard. As a member of the International Labor Organization, the United States government is obligated to respect and promote the rights outlined in the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, including the following: freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining. Number two, an elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. Democratic and Republican administrations in the past have insisted that our trading partners abide by and enforce these basic labor rights, and Congress has repeatedly ratified these obligations. But today, this committee will vote on a bill that does just the opposite for American workers when it comes to freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining at tribal enterprises. This legislation would jettison the balance between tribal sovereignty and workers' rights that was adopted by the NLRB in the year 2004 under President Bush and sustained by every court that has reviewed it since then. The current legal framework respects treaty rights, respects tribal rights of the self-governance in intramural matters, and accommodates the unique status of Indians in our society and legal culture. It is also based on precedents that have been upheld by appeals courts over the past 30 years. The Congressional Budget Office has cautioned that by eliminating the federal right of tribal enterprises, the employees to join together to improve wages and working conditions, this legislation would suppress wages. H.R. 511 does this by eliminating the right of affected employees to file a claim with the NLRB, individually or through a union, regarding the labor practices by tribal employers that prohibit or interfere with activities to improve wages and working conditions in enterprises on tribal land. Thousands of employees at commercial tribal enterprises are currently covered by collective bargaining agreements. H.R. 511, if H.R. 11 were enacted, it could determine the enforceability of these labor contracts. When a labor contract expires, a tribe could unilaterally terminate the established bargaining relationship with that union without legal consequence. Without a union, these jobs will likely revert to low-wage service jobs instead of jobs that allow workers to climb the ladder of the middle class. Sorry. Turn it off. While tribes are sovereign, they must comply with many labor and employment laws of general applicability, such as the FLSA with OSHA and FMLA. This legislation singles out the NLRA and promotes actions that would diminish the standard of living for workers employed in tribal enterprises. Though some tribes fairly point out that they have tribal labor ordinances that protect workers' rights to organize and collectively bargain, it's evident that other tribes do not. By taking an all-or-nothing approach, this bill fails to ensure that workers have basic rights where there is no tribal labor ordinance or one that is ineffective. Finally, in closing, I want to say that we must consider that non-tribal employees of Indian tribal enterprises have no political rights to influence or even participate in the governance of the tribe. We know, for example, that some 600,000 workers are employed in tribal casinos, but 75% are not members of tribes. These workers have no say in tribal laws governing their workplace environment. Given that tribes have sovereign immunity in state and federal courts, what safety net remains in place when rights are stripped under the NLRA? Unfortunately, the Labor Sovereignty Act is fundamentally flawed and is not fixable by amendment. And it's for those reasons I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 511 for amendment. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize Mr. Wakita to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize Mr. Wakita for 5 minutes to explain the substitute.
Thank you, Chairman Klein, and thank you for giving H.R. 511 some time today. Before I explain the technical changes, including in the substitute amendment, I'd like to take a minute to discuss the importance of the broader legislation, and in doing so, would consider it obviating, if not alleviating, a lot of Mr. Hinojos' concerns. As the Chairman said, the purpose of this bill is simple: to protect the sovereignty and promote governmental parity of Native Americans by making it very clear that tribal businesses on tribal lands are free to operate with the same autonomy provided to any other sovereign body, like the same autonomy given our own federal, state, and local governments. Now, since the early 1830s, this hasn't been an issue, since our courts have held that, quote, tribes possess a nationhood status and retain inherent powers of self-government, unquote. Over the years, there has been widespread agreement on both sides of the aisle that these rights should be protected and that tribes should remain sovereign, free to govern and develop policies that best meet the needs of their members. Unfortunately, in recent years, the National Labor Relations Board has threatened that sovereignty by exerting control over tribal businesses. Now, this indeed is a change in policy by the NLRB. For nearly 70 years, the NLRB respected Native American sovereignty, holding that tribes should be free from outside intervention. But in 2004, the board reversed course and overturned longstanding precedent with its San Manuel Bingo and Casino decision. Now, since then, the board has used a subjective sort of test to determine when and where it wants to exert its jurisdiction over Native American tribes. Now, there shouldn't be a test period, as said at the hearing a few weeks ago on H.R. 11. And not surprisingly, the Native American community strongly opposed the board's move, and today we continue to hear strong concerns with what many consider an attack on tribal sovereignty. Unfortunately, these concerns seem to have fallen on deaf ears at the NLRB as the board continues to exert its authority over Native American tribes. Unfortunately, the problem is only getting worse, not better, and it's creating uncertainty for tribal governments and tribally owned businesses, often in regions that can least afford it, regions I've visited myself. Now, at the subcommittee hearing just last month, tribal leaders said they've seen, quote, an increasingly aggressive approach to enforcement by the board, which creates unacceptable risks and uncertainties for all tribal nation rights under federal law and to their dignity as sovereigns, unquote. If enacted, this act will put an end to the board's overreach and give authority over labor relations back to the tribal governments where it belongs, if in fact we believe that tribes are sovereign. As Dr. Rowe said at the subcommittee hearing, quote, "We should never stand idly by while the sovereignty of Native Americans is threatened," unquote. And that's why we're here today. The legislation we're considering will prevent the NLRB from asserting its jurisdiction over businesses owned by Native Americans on tribal lands. It is bipartisan. It is a common sense proposal that will provide legal certainty to the Native American community and restore a standard that was in place for years before the misguided NLRB San Manuel decision. So with that, I appreciate all that my colleagues have done over the years to move this issue forward. Today, Mr. Chairman, we certainly stand on the shoulders of others who have pushed this issue before, and for those that are still around, we look forward to having their support on the floor if this bill passes. I'm very pleased that we're taking this step today. The technical change in the proposed substitute amendment clarifies that the National Labor Relations Act does not apply to tribal enterprises and institutions as well as the tribal governments themselves. I urge my colleagues to support the substitute as well as the underlying bill to help provide Native American tribes the legal clarity and labor sovereignty they deserve, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. Does any member seek recognition on the substitute? Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for accommodating an impossible schedule by delaying the hearing. We don't have to, a lot of things we don't agree on, but I think being able to work together makes life a lot easier for everybody, and I certainly appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, just very briefly, the right to basic labor rights are rights that we've been arguing for, as the gentleman from Texas has indicated in his statement, in all of our international agreements. It's particularly important in this case because at least 75% of the hundreds of thousands of workers that may be affected by this legislation are not members of any tribe. And in some areas, virtually all of the workers are not members of tribes and would lose their labor rights under this legislation. So I would hope that we would try to find some accommodation of sovereignty rights without denying the basic fundamental rights of workers that this bill attacks. So I would hope we'd vote no on the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? Any members seeking recognition? Any member seeking recognition? Indicate by raising your hand. Okay. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I'm a little lower down on the line. I thought someone else might be speaking first here. I just want to add, I guess, to what our ranking member said on a couple fronts. It appears to me that this has a lot more to do about the NLRB than it does about sovereignty. And I think I mentioned it when we had this hearing before. If this were really an issue about sovereignty, I'd love to have that debate because there are at least 6 major federal laws and employment laws that affect sovereignty, from the Fair Labor Standards Act, OSHA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, Family and Medical Leave Act, Title III of the American Disabilities Act. There are a number of provisions that affect sovereignty. And while we use sovereignty in this case, for those of us who have served on this committee for a while, we know that there is a Captain Ahab-like obsession with the NLRB. There are people who literally every day find a new reason to try to beat up the NLRB and labor rights. And unfortunately, from my past experience in Wisconsin, whether it be around issues like the racism that surrounded the spear fishing in northern Wisconsin, whether it be about the fight to try to change mascots in this country, I don't often find the chamber and some of the groups that are supporting this to be there with us. It's not like they are great supporters of sovereignty and our tribes, but they are great supporters of trying to destroy the NLRB. So what I really wish, if we wanted to have a debate, Mr. Chairman, about sovereignty, was we would have a bill that included all of these options, and I would love to have that debate because I think there is a debate about sovereignty, and then there's a debate about sovereignty, which is really about another crack at the NLRB. And for that reason, I think we have a misguided proposal before us, and I would hope that those who support sovereignty, at least in their words, would show it in their actions with a bill that would be much more inclusive, rather than what unfortunately looks like another attack on an agency that we will have again and again and again before this committee with more attempts to try to destroy.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to be recognized? Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I promise to be brief, sir. I'd like to first thank Congressman Rokita for his leadership on this important issue, and the chairman for calling today's markup. I'm a proud sponsor of H.R. 511, which is widely supported by the tribes across the state of Michigan. To me, this is a straightforward and common sense bill that upholds tribal sovereignty, which is extremely important. It does so by making certain tribal governments are treated the same as federal, state, and local governments under the NLRA. I think this is best summed up, as far as my support is concerned, by a letter that was submitted by the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan, which I will quote in pertinent part, which provides, H.R. 511 builds upon a principle that has been amply demonstrated by Indian tribes across the country. When tribal sovereignty is respected and acknowledged, economic success follows. I agree, Mr. Chairman, and I encourage all my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking to be recognized? I see no hands. It is my understanding that we have no additional amendments to H.R. 511. If that is not true, we need to see a hand. Okay. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Before we conclude today's markup, I'd like to take just a brief moment to recognize a member of my staff sitting next to me who is leaving the committee to pursue a new opportunity. I think I may have called him a dirty rat for choosing to leave, but Marvin Kaplan has been a trusted member of this team since the early days of the Republican majority. He's been at the forefront of our efforts to ensure federal labor policies are being implemented fairly and objectively, which means he has been at the center of some really tough battles. Through it all, Marvin has always provided me and my colleagues wise counsel while also maintaining his good sense of humor. And some days you need that sense of humor. He's experienced his fair share of late nights and long weekends, helping the committee advance an agenda we believe reflects the best interests of America's workers and job creators. As a proud father and devoted husband, Marvin will be pursuing a new opportunity that promises to provide more flexibility between work and family obligations. We'll certainly miss him, but we can't blame him for doing what he believes is best for his family, and that's precisely the kind of smart decision-making we've come to expect. So, Marvin, on behalf of myself and the committee, thank you. Thank you for years of hard work. Godspeed, fair winds and following seas. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman, a lot is said about the working relationships around here and how bad they are from time to time. Staff can contribute to that. I'd just like to say that Mr. Kaplan has not been part of that. He's been very cooperative. Even when you disagree, we have been able to work with my staff in good working relationship, cooperative relationship. So I want to add my 2 cents worth to your congratulations and Godspeed.
I thank the gentleman, and again, Marvin, thank you. And I threw out that dirty rat thing sort of as a joke, but I know that on both sides, when we lose key members of our staff, there is at least a few seconds when we have that thought, like, what do you mean you're leaving? But Marvin, again, tremendous work, and we really do wish you the very best. Okay, back to work here. If there are no other members who wish to speak on the bill, I'll entertain a motion to report the bill and recognize Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill, H.R. 511, to the House of Representatives with an amendment and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and that the bill as amended do pass.
The question is on favor of reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 511 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present, and I now recognize Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary and technical changes to the bill and pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L. I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file additional or minority views.
Without objection, so ordered. Committee stands adjourned.